Shalom, I'm Tony Robinson of Restoration of Torah Ministries, and I'm here this week with our Haftarah Connections lecture. And this week what we're going to be doing is looking at Parashat Vayeira, and he appeared. And that Torah portion extends from Genesis chapter 18 verse 1 through chapter 22 verse 24. That's the Torah portion reading. And the Haftarah reading is from 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 37. And again, as I start off each one of these Haftarah Connections lectures, I pose the question, why was 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 1 through 37 chosen as the Haftarah reading for Parashat Vayeira? And what we're going to see is that the sages of Israel, they chose this particular reading from the prophets because of all of the thematic connections that are made between the Torah portion and the Haftarah reading. Now you remember from last week's lecture in Parashat Lech Lecha that there weren't that many thematic connections as far as similar words and similar phrases, but there were connections as far as experience, what Israel in exile was experiencing as far as the Haftarah reading is concerned, and what Abraham and Sarah were experiencing as far as the Torah portion was concerned. And we mentioned that sometimes the Haftarah readings, sometimes they contain lots of words and phrases that are repeated in the Haftarah and the Torah portion, and sometimes there are only a few. Now, this week in Parashat Vayeira, there are a ton of thematic connections, okay? And what we're gonna do first is we're gonna go through these similar words and phrases. We're gonna show you how abundant they are, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to propose to you why this is true, why there are so many words and phrases that are mentioned in both the Torah portion and in the Haftarah reading. And then after that, I'm going to propose to you the interpretation of those connections. So let's start off, and let's note, let's note our first thematic connection. Our first thematic connection has to deal with the fact that both the Torah portion and the Haftarah reading mention someone who is prominent, a prominent person. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8, we're going to compare that verse to Genesis chapter 23, verse 6. In 2 Kings 4, verse 8, it says that the woman of Shunem was a great woman, or in some translations it says that she was a prominent woman. Okay, now we know that Abraham and Sarah, that they were prominent people also. You remember that when Abraham wanted to bury Sarah, his wife, and he went to the children of Het to secure a burial place, listen to what they said, the children of Het said in Genesis 23 verse 6. They said to Abraham, "You are a mighty prince among us." Okay? They recognized Abraham, and they knew that he was not just, the hoi polloi, just the common person. They knew that in their eyes, he was a mighty prince. That is thematically connected to the woman of Shunem, whom it says she was a prominent woman. Of course, Sarah would have been a prominent woman also, along with Abraham. So that's our first thematic connection between the Torah portion and the Haftarah reading. The second connection that we want to see is 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 9 through 10, versus Genesis chapter 18, verses 1 through 9. And in these verses, what we see is a similar event. And this time, the event is an act of hospitality. Okay? So, for instance, the woman of Shunem, she made an extra room for Elijah on the roof of her house. Okay? That was an act of hospitality. For Abraham Abraham fed the three visitors, okay? That was his act of hospitality. And you notice that when the three visitors came, that it says that he moved with quickness, okay? He said, Sarah, hurry, 3 sales of flour, they were running and hurrying so that they could prepare this meal for those 3 visitors. So the common theme in this case is similar event or actions where there is an act of hospitality. All right, the next connection that we see between the Torah portion and the Haftarah reading is in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 12, versus Genesis chapter 18, verse 9, where there is a question about the whereabouts of the women in these 2 respective stories. So, for instance, in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 12, Elisha, he said, summon that Shunammite woman. Okay, he said that to Gehazi. He's like, go get that go get the Shunammite woman. Tell her to come here. And in Genesis chapter 18, verse 9, remember the 2 visitors to Abraham. They said, where's Sarah, your wife? Okay, so that's the common connection here. Is that in both of these readings, there's a question about the whereabouts of Sarah versus the woman of Shunem. Okay, another connection is 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 14, versus Genesis chapter 18, verse 11. So, for instance, it says, verily, in 2 Kings 4:14, Gehazi is speaking to Elisha, and he says, well, verily, she has no child. Okay, Elisha was trying to figure out, well, what kind of way could he repay the woman for her acts of hospitality? So he asked Gehazi, what can we do for this woman? And so Gehazi rightfully perceives, hey, verily she has no child. Well, that's thematically connected to Genesis chapter 18, verse 11, where it says, the manner of women has ceased to be with Sarah, and she was barren. And so again, both of the stories are pointing out that Sarah and the woman of Shunem were both barren. So that's another thematic connection. And so for some of you who may just now be joining my Haftarah Connections lectures, you can see that what we're doing is we're looking for thematic connections, similar words, phrases, events, circumstances that are in the 2 readings, and we're seeing that there are an abundance of those. How about this? 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 14. After one of the things that is said about the woman of Shunem, it says, and her husband is old. Okay, and her husband is old. That's thematically connected to Genesis chapter 18, verse 12, where it's where Sarah, in her disbelief that she will have a child the next year, she said, and my Lord being old also. My Lord being old also. And so in both, so here again we have a similar circumstance, because in both of the readings we read about the wife of the husband of a barren woman who is old. Okay. Now here's something that's this is a great connection. I just love this, and this has the signature of Adonai all over it. In 2 Kings 4, verse 15, versus Genesis chapter 18, verse 10. In 2 Kings 4, it says that she stood in the door. Okay, speaking of the woman of Shunem, that she stood in the doorway. Well, that's thematically connected to Genesis 18:10, where it says, and Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent. Now, you notice how both of these stories fill in this particular detail. I mean, both, in other words, why was it that Moses, when he wrote Genesis 18:10, added the fact that Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, whereas the writer of 2 Kings, he makes it a point to note that the woman of Shunem stood in the door. Well, that's obviously a thematic connection connecting these 2 stories. It talks about both of these women being in an entranceway or doorway. All right, another connection is 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 16 versus Genesis 18:14. And I'm going to read both of these to you and listen to the similarity of these statements. And so what we're going to see in this connection here, we're going to see this profound, absolutely profound connection between the Torah reading and the Haftarah reading. So listen to 2 Kings 4:16. Then he said, about this time next year you shall embrace a son. That was the promise that Elisha gave to the woman of Shunem. He said, about this time next year you shall embrace a son. That is thematically connected to Genesis 18:14, and listen to this. It says, at the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Now that is just, if that's not just a pure thematic connection, where we have almost a similar statement, then I don't know what a thematic connection is. Okay, so again, now one thing I want to point out to you is that in 2 Kings 4:16, where it says about this time, that phrase this time, this just translated I think in the New King James, if you look in the Hebrew, that this time is actually the Hebrew word la moed, okay? And for those of you who are learning Hebrew, you know that the word moed means an appointed time. It's also translated as a feast. In Leviticus 23, when it talks about the 7 feasts of the Lord, those are the 7 moedim. So you can hear the word moed in there. And so likewise, in Genesis 18:14, if you look in the Hebrew, at where it says, at the appointed time I will return to you, that word at the appointed time in Hebrew is la moed. Okay, so again, it's the same word. And so this is why we know that that Isaac was born on a particular feast day. Okay, the only question that one would need to answer is which one. But you can rest assured that Isaac was born on one of the 7 holy days, on one of the 7 holidays, one of the 7 feasts. And Adonai is hinting at this by saying that he's going to be born at this time, or at the appointed time, la moed, next year. Okay, we also have a thematic connection between 2 Kings 4:16 and Genesis 18:12, where both the woman of Shunem and Sarah expressed disbelief in the prophecy given to them that at that time in the next year that they would have a son. So in 2 Kings 4:16, and she said, no, my lord, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. Excuse me. And she said this in response to Elisha's statement that, hey, at this time next year you're going to have a son. And she says, oh, I can just hear her now. I mean, I can hear, just kind of the tone of her voice. And she said, oh, no, my lord, no, man of God, do not lie to your maidservant. You don't have to say that. No, you don't have to do that. And see, she's expressing disbelief. Well, that's thematically connected to Genesis 18:12. It's Sarah's disbelief in the promise given to her by the two men. It says, therefore Sarah laughed within herself, saying, and I can hear Sarah too. She's like, right. After I've grown old, shall I have pleasure? My Lord being old also? Yeah, sure, I'm going to have a child next year. And so what we see here is that both of these women are expressing disbelief in the promise that they're going to have a son. Okay, now, earlier we read one verse. We read a verse from the Haftarah reading and a verse from the Torah portion where they sounded very similar. Listen to this. Okay, if you thought the first one was similar, listen to this. In 2 Kings chapter 4 verse 17 reads this way. But the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come, of which Elisha had told her. Now I want to read this again. I want you to hear the flow of this, because we're going to read something in Genesis chapter 21 verse 2 that's going to be almost identical. Listen to this. But the woman conceived and bore a son when the appointed time had come, of which Elisha had told her. Now listen to Genesis 21:3. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken. So, I mean, this is incredible, incredible literary, verbal, plenary connection between these two. But the woman conceived, for Sarah conceived, and bore a son, and bore Abraham a son, when the appointed time had come, at the set time that Elisha told her that God had spoken to him. I mean, these are almost exactly identical statements made in these two different readings, and they are the basis for the sages of Israel choosing the story of the woman of Shunem and her son as the Haftarah reading for the Torah portion. So let's look at another connection. Here's just a little small detail, but watch how it connects these two stories so powerfully. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 18, it says, "And the child grew." Speaking of the son that the woman of Shunem bore. It says, "And the child grew." Well, in Genesis chapter 21, verse 8, speaking of Isaac, it says, "So the child grew." Okay, again, we're having these thematic connections, these similar words and phrases between the Torah portion and the Haftarah reading. Now let's compare 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 20b with Genesis 22, chapter 22, verse 10. Because now we're going to see another connection, and this is a good one here. Listen to this. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 20b, "When he had taken him and brought him to his mother, he sat on her knees till noon and then died." Okay, so this is when the son of the woman of Shunem, her son died on her knees. So the woman of Shunem's son literally dies. Now watch this. We're going to see another connection to Isaac here. "And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son." So what we see here is that the woman of Shunem, her son literally dies, whereas Isaac is brought to death's door. I mean, Isaac is flirting with death at this point, even though he does not literally die. And so again, that's the connection between the two. Now what I want to do is I want to again compare two statements, one from the Haftarah reading, one from the Torah portion, and look at how similar they are. This is the third time we're going to see this. 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 22 through 23 and verse 26. It says, "The Shunammite woman asked for one of the attendants and a donkey so she could hurry to the man of God and return." And in response to a question, when Elisha said, "How are you?" she said, "It is well." Compare that to Genesis chapter 22, verses 3 through 5, where it says, "Abraham took 2 young men, or attendants, with him and a donkey, and he promised the young men that I and the lad, Isaac, will go yonder. We will worship and we will return to you." So what are the connections? Number one, the woman of Shunem asked for attendants. Abraham took attendants. It talks about how the woman of Shunem took a donkey. Abraham took a donkey. And in the story with Abraham, Abraham is on his way to Mount Moriah. It talks about how she's going to hurry to the man of God and return. Abraham said, "We're going to go over there and worship, and then we will return to you." And the other thing is there is a profound statement of faith in both of these stories. With the woman of Shunem, now her son had died. Her son had died, and she's on her way to Elisha so that she can ask him to resurrect her son. She had one thing in her mind. She knew that if she could get to the prophet, that he would intercede on her behalf and raise her son from the dead. So when the question is asked to her, "How is it with you?" even though her son has just died, she said, "It is well. It is well." And you want to know something? That was a statement of her faith because she knew that her son would be resurrected. Well, Abraham, in the same passage that's thematically connected to the Shunammite woman's statement of faith, Abraham makes a profound statement of faith. For when he talks to the attendants, he said, "I and the lad will go yonder, we will worship," and he says, "We will return to you." Now, how can that be? Because Abraham knows what Adonai commanded him, and Abraham knows what he's about to do, right? Abraham knows that he is going to sacrifice his son, and yet to his attendants, he says, "I and the lad will worship, and we will return to you." And he wasn't just lying to them, not wanting to tell them what was going on. It was a statement of his faith also in the promises of Adonai. Look at this connection in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 25. It says, and so she departed and went to the man of God at Mount Carmel. So it was when the man of God saw her afar off. Okay, so there's two things I want you to key on, is that she went to the man of God on Mount Carmel, and it says that as she approached, he saw her from afar off. That is thematically connected to Genesis chapter 22, verses 3 and 4, where it says that it talks about how Abraham arose and went to the place, that would be Mount Moriah, of which God had spoken to him. Then on the third day, Abraham lifted his eyes and saw the place from afar. Okay, and there are two connections. Just as the woman of Shunem went to Mount Carmel, Abraham went to Mount Moriah. So they both go to a mount. The second connection is that Elisha saw her from afar off. That is thematically connected to when Abraham saw the place from afar off. And so, again, this is absolutely amazing. This is beautiful that we have these two stories that were written in two totally different time periods, different characters, different situations, and yet at the same time we see all sorts of literary allusions from one story to the other. If you're reading the story of the woman of Shunem, you should be able to see all sorts of connections to the story of the binding of Isaac and of the birth of Isaac. If you're reading the story in Genesis 18 through 22 about the birth and then the binding of Isaac, which we're about to get into now, then you're going to see all sorts of allusions to the story of the woman of Shunem. Okay, so we've seen some connections now between these two stories. So let's look at it a little bit closer now. The woman of Shunem. This is obviously a story that's comparing the woman of Shunem and her son to Sarah and her son in their birth, as far as the woman of Shunem is concerned, with the birth and the maturation and the literal death of her son, whereas with Sarah it's about the birth, the maturation, and the near death experience of her son Isaac. So we have two stories about death and or the near death, and then the resurrection of a young boy born to a barren woman and an elderly man. Both of these two stories carry these themes. So the story of the resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son is clearly thematically connected to the story of the binding of Isaac. Okay, that's what's going on here. Adonai has connected these two stories by all of the literary connections. Now, here's the point that I want to make as we're talking right now about this in these Haftarah lectures series. This idea that when we read the story of the birth and the binding of Isaac and his near death, that we are supposed to compare that to the story of the woman of Shunem and the death and resurrection of her son, that is Adonai's idea. That's not my idea. That's not the idea of the sages of Israel who chose this reading as a Haftarah reading for Parashat Vayeira. This is Adonai. This is Yod-Heh Vav-Heh. This is the Lord himself. This is God who has put these connections, because and I assume that I'm speaking to people who understand that the scriptures were written by the finger of God. That yes, he used people, but they were men of God who were borne along by the Ruach HaKodesh, or the Holy Spirit. They penned the very words of God. And so when we see literary allusions that are clearly connecting these two stories together, this is the hand of God. This is the hand of Adonai who's doing this. And so when we see this, that's why I say this is Adonai's idea, not mine, and it should be plain to see. All we have to do is believe in inspiration of the scripture. If we believe that the scriptures are inspired, if we believe that, then it's plain to see that Adonai put all these connections in here so that we could connect these two stories. The only question is why, okay? And so that's what we're gonna do. And we're gonna see what happens. We're gonna see what happens when you study thematically. This is what happens as you study thematically. You begin to see this because the scripture is arranged in themes, and Adonai wants us to make the connections, but why? Okay? So we understand now that the story of the death and resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son has been connected to the story of the binding of Isaac. All right, so what we see is that literally Adonai is shouting. I mean, I can, think about this. If Adonai is going to create a bunch of stories, and if he wants you to see a connection between two stories, what better way to let you see the connections than to have all sorts of literary instances where they're similar and they're almost saying the same thing. This is him shouting at us saying, hey, when you read the story of the binding of Isaac, I want you to go and read the story of the resurrection of the Shunammite woman's son. Or this is his way of shouting at us saying, hey, when you read the story of the woman of Shunem, or the woman of Shunem, I can't remember which one I said first now, but when you read either one of these stories, he wants you to think about the other story. And that's why we have all of these similar words and phrases, etc. So what is his purpose in doing this? Why is Adonai doing this? Why does he have all these allusions between these two stories? What does he want us to see? Okay, why are there so many similarities between these two stories? Okay, and that's what we're going to talk to you about in the second half of this teaching. We're going to gain an understanding of why all these thematic connections exist.
Enough energy, it's getting too loud for me. The room is so bright, it's too hard to see.